From major releases that were graphically ahead of the time to underrated bangers with unique mechanics that were odd yet revolutionary for their day, there are some amazing SNES games that saw into the future. We're not going to talk about either Zelda or Mario here because you all know how much they changed everything already, right? I'm Jimmy for Cultured Vultures. I somehow managed to not reference F-Zero in this video, and here are the SNES games that were way ahead of their time. But first, this video is sponsored by us. Yeah! We've actually never had a sponsor on this channel, so if you like what we do, please consider checking out our merch shop or become a member for stuff like early access and discount codes for that merch. Links are in the description. Despite an association with some of the worst licensed games in history, Ocean also turned out shockingly solid games like the 1993 SNES tie-in for Jurassic Park that some might say is an early example of a sandbox game. Okay, so calling this a sandbox game isn't quite accurate. You can't run anyone over or defeat some weird dragon who's been stealing all your mine coins or whatever, for instance. Even so, with a unique blend of first person and top-down perspectives that simply drops you into the world of this game and leaves you to mostly complete the many tasks found across the island without much guidance at all, there's little in the SNES catalogue quite like this particular version of Jurassic Park. Your main goal in Jurassic Park is to escape the island as Dr. Grant, but really, as we said before, the game doesn't keep you on a particularly linear path. Armed with a range of weapons, the gameplay and problem solving can at times feel a little, and we obviously mean a little here, like The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, again a little, but with killer dinosaurs and atmospheric abandoned buildings instead. It's only when you go inside one of these buildings that the game smoothly switches to a surprising action-packed first-person perspective and you gotta activate Frank Reynolds mode. Jurassic Park isn't without its flaws though. The fact that you're trundling around with no direction or any idea what you have to do, like a missed prototype being one of them, but is a surprisingly forward-thinking game for the Super Nintendo and one that might just take you by surprise. While you wrap your increasingly porridged mind around the horrifying fact that the 1993 Super Nintendo hit Star Fox is over 30 years old, remember that even at the time, Star Fox was hailed as revolutionary, and not just because it puts a fox in drip long before Zootopia came along. Part of the game's reason for even existing was simply to prove the Super Nintendo could handle something as relatively complex as polygonal graphics, and yeah, it does, although Star Fox naturally looks a little rougher today than it did 30 plus years ago. But you would expect that because you too probably don't look quite as good as you did even like a week ago, and everything screens when you stand up and everything sometimes gets quite blurry for no reasons. Guys, am I dying? And all things considered, Star Fox still looks fantastic and plays quite well. The game is a sheer force of ambition that didn't forget to be just a lot of fun to play as well. If there's any secret to the game's relative immortality, it would be that. Playing as Fox McCloud, Star Fox has you and your team flying to different locations in the Lilat system in a bid to destroy the evil scientist Andros once and for all. The game's story and evolving narrative aren't particularly deep, but the cast is likeable and only add to the rich atmosphere of Star Fox that remains exceptional to this day. It's so nice that Nintendo has basically redone it twice. Do it one more time though, go on a day. A question time. What was the original name for Star Fox Adventures? Comment your answer down below and you could win a free Steam key for free. The SNES hit even greater heights in 1994 with a number of critical releases, including Super Metroid, which today is widely considered one of the greatest video games of all time by pretty much everyone who's ever picked up a controller. A visually beautiful, infuriatingly difficult at times, and utterly captivating game in 1994, the game today, with no changes, wouldn't be too out of place among the very best indie games, especially if we're talking about the Metroidvania genre that this game directly continues to inspire to this day. The other game, of course, being FIFA 96. Super Metroid partially works so well because it requires so many different elements of strategy. Not only do you have to explore and unlock the game's many secrets using things like your grappling beam to reach new areas, utilising physics rarely seen before in games, while the Morph Ball is honestly such a genius idea that we're still seeing versions of it in today's games. All of this points to a game that is still absolutely exhilarating, particularly when you finish the final, enormously difficult and some might say bullshit boss battle. Super Metroid, like a lot of Metroid games that are good, doesn't spend a ton of time on its story, but what we do get over the course of Samus's frightening journey into the planet of Zebes is a tough-as-nails hero who controls like a dream, no matter which decade you might be playing this game in. A game that wouldn't exist without Super Metroid basically comes out every single day, and it deserves every bit of the near universal high regard it continues to receive. From Animal Crossing to Stardew Valley, the list of games that owe a debt to the 1996 late SNES release Harvest Moon is long. The first in the Story of Seasons franchise, which continues to this day, albeit with different developers and a lot of confusion, Harvest Moon is still a ton of fun to pick up and play. You can pick up the pace of everything quite easily, and you'll be amazed at just how much the original game packed into its Super Nintendo cartridge. While comparatively a little simplistic compared to modern sandbox games inspired by it, Harvest Moon nevertheless has you clearing land, planting and caring for your crops, and harvesting moons. No, you don't do that. You'll need to raise livestock, occasionally forage, and even build important relationships with the other people in your town. If that sounds familiar, it's because we're getting new games that wouldn't exist without Harvest Moon pretty much all the time. The original Harvest Moon for the SNES remains fantastic because the simple fact is that the game is just a lot of cozy fun, even if it is obviously lacking a couple quality of life things. The graphics are bright and charming, offering a surprising amount of depth and detail as menial tasks are simple to learn and satisfying to complete. Harvest Moon on the SNES is pretty close to timeless, and we're probably going to be getting games like it for the rest of time. Shame this next game is such a rarity though. If you're interested in more games along the very specific lines of Final Fantasy Tactics, you absolutely need to check out the underrated 1993 SNES classic Ogre Battle: The March of the Black Queen. A tactical RPG with great graphics that hold up better than you'd think, the story of a band of rebels going after an evil reigning empire is also more than enough to fully immerse you in a game that recently passed its 30th anniversary. With deep management and careful multifaceted combat strategy as the heart and soul of the March of the Black Queen, the influence of this game's appeal isn't hard to spot in games like Final Fantasy Tactics and Unicorn Overlord. Ogre Battle: The March of the Black Queen derives its name from no less than 2 Queen songs, but whereas Queen is always destined to be played at any congregation of more than like 20 people, everything in Ogre Battle is a lot less predictable. The game uses a pretty novel for the time alignment system, which is basically like Karma mechanics, ideal for those 7th generation fans who miss them being in every game. As well as affecting gameplay with things like evil characters being stronger at night, your character's alignment also dictates which one of 13 endings you will unlock. So yeah, it's absolutely crazily ambitious for 1993, but unfortunately that ambition has never been met with a ton of sales, and there hasn't been a brand new installment in the series since Tactics Ogre: The Night of Lodis on the GBA in 2001. Nuts. Monkey nuts. Donkey Kong Country is a selection here that should surprise exactly no one, especially if you remember the overwhelming praise the game received even in its time, as well as the fact that it has a level called Vulture Culture. Vultures together strong. Donkey Kong Country woke up a sleepy franchise with a platformer that looked as good as almost anything you could find on the 32-bit consoles, like the Saturn in 1994, with DKC being one of the first console games to feature pre-rendered graphics. If you ask people which SNES games they could still pick up and play today, there's a high chance this will be their very first answer. Armed with distinctive, extremely likeable characters like Donkey and Diddy Kong, who was of course ahead of his time in owning 2,000 bottles of baby oil, Donkey Kong Country sets you off to some of the hardest platformer levels you will ever encounter. The gameplay is simple enough as a platformer, but what makes Donkey Kong Country ahead of its time is that it really does look like it could have been released on the follow-up generation. For constantly breaking the fourth wall, having more collectibles than a guy who's definitely totally okay with turning 30, and featuring multiple modes so your friends can get in on the monkey business too, Donkey Kong Country and its two rage-inducing brilliant SNES sequels changed the game forever. The presence of pre-rendered graphics in Donkey Kong Country may have been pivotal, but a 1995 side-scrolling action game for the Super Nintendo having them too is nothing short of impressive. That's exactly what developer Rainbow Arts achieved relatively late into the life of the console, with a furiously paced combination of run and gun and rail shooter styles that unfortunately didn't get an official Western release until just recently. Originally, the game was released in Japan only, with just 10,000 copies available. The Super Famicom edition of Rendering Ranger R2 still commands a pretty high price among collectors, so Super Famicom completionists may want to keep that in mind. Or they could use a search engine for specific queries. Matey. Rendering Ranger R2 visually belongs in the same category as Donkey Kong Country, which isn't something a lot of SNES/Super Famicom games can claim. The graphics alone will bring to mind an early PS1 aesthetic, and then you have simple gameplay married to sadistically difficult stages filled with unrelenting powerful bosses, all at 60 frames per second. Rendering Ranger R2 is supremely underrated as Super Nintendo games go, and considering how groundbreaking it was in the mid-90s, that's too bad. If you're a fan of either genre represented here, or even got a kick out of the supremely underrated Velocity 2X, you need to play this. If you haven't, get your act Razor together. ActRaiser was an early indication of the graphic, sound and overall scale the Super Nintendo offered in comparison to its NES predecessor. While you may not be able to see it quite so strongly today, the leap was pretty profound back in 1990. A combination of platformer and the sort of game that today would be called sandbox, with some shooter elements thrown in because why the hell not? ActRaiser was one of the most unique home console games released up to that point. While the Western version of the game made some changes to the names of characters, the Japanese version is very clear that you are God, and it's up to you to kick Satan's ass, build a cool world, and tell that Jesus kid to stay out of Rome for a while. At least until Season 2. Okay, the last part doesn't come up, but Tomoyoshi Miyazaki anticipated a lot in 1990, which makes sense given the ambition developer quintet threw behind this game, with you able to build stuff in an overworld in between the more traditional action platformer sections. Games with multiple genres was nothing new in 1990, but ActRaiser tried for a stranger blend of styles for the time, and that's something we would see later in games like the 2000 PS2 must-have Dark Cloud, which was and still remains an absolute whipper. There's also games like the 2019 release Soul Seraph, a frustratingly uneven tribute to all things ActRaiser. You may just want to stick with the two original games and the good but flawed 2021 remake that sadly not a lot of people seem to play. If there's one thing in particular you should take from this video, it's that Enix and Quintet back in the day were far more innovative as a whole than they're often given credit for. Terranigma, an action RPG that looks absolutely stunning and ended one of the most underappreciated unofficial trilogies by following Soul Blazer and Illusion of Gaia, is another remarkable example from everyone involved. What might frustrate you though is that it never officially came to America. Why? Well, in simplest terms, it comes down to a rights issue and the inability to find former Quintet president Tomoyoshi Miyazaki, who also wrote ActRaiser, but people are working on it. Don't hold your breath on a remaster anytime soon though, as that story was from 3 years ago, but luckily there's a translation from the UK/Australia release that brings home the game's profound, surprisingly complex themes, which can be best explained with this insane concept by director Miyazaki, who once described Terranigma as being a game that shows humanity from the perspective of the Earth and how it views human activity. Gameplay-wise, Terranigma was pretty novel for the time for being an action RPG, floating numbers and all, in which the way you're moving dictates the kind of actions you can pull off, but it's the game's sprawling, emotionally complex narrative that really establishes Terranigma as being ahead of its time. Tuck in some stunning visuals, absolute bopper of a soundtrack, and huge scale for exploration, and you've got a game that American foreign ambassadors should be knocking on some doors about. Come on, expand your horizons. Calling to mind two of the biggest games of the last decade and also Kevin Costner, Uncharted Waters New Horizons is packed with plenty of strategic top-down combat, but there's a lot more to the game than battling explorers, naval officers, pirates, and your own people management skills. Uncharted Waters New Horizons is a simulation game, the second in the series and first for the SNES, and a highly unique one at that. Choosing one of 6 distinct characters with their own narratives, Uncharted Waters New Horizons has you planning things down to the trade route across the 7 seas that will go a long way towards determining not only your success in the game, but also the story you experience. By building relationships as you develop your routes and build up your fortunes, you have a game that was unlike anything the SNES had at the time. Its complexities are still highly enjoyable today, and you'll likely marvel at how Uncharted Waters New Horizons gave players an almost unheard of degree of freedom and exploration in 1993, so it's a real shame that it itself is largely unheard of. But the IP itself has had a whole host of games, including a 2023 version called Uncharted Waters Origin, which is apparently a microtransaction-filled MMO. Boo. Games like Uncharted Waters New Horizons were proving just how deep a simulation could go, and in the present day we're seeing just how hard it is for developers to follow its lead. Outro gang, that was our video looking at some SNES games that were way ahead of their time, and let me tell you, my back really hurts to the point where I think my time has come. I'm gonna go lie down for a bit. I've been Jimmy for Cultured Vultures, it's been good to have you, and thank you for watching.